Hello, operator. Operator.
Hello. May I help you?
Gracie. Gracie, is that you? It's me, George.
George? Oh, George, is it really you? Oh, I'm on the switchboard tonight. And George, the man upstairs is very upset with you. Yes, well, he doesn't like you doing any more of those films about him. No, he says you're too old for the part, George. Oh, I gotta go. I have Jack Benny on hold. He wants to make another collect call. When am I gonna see you?
Well, not for a while, kid. I tell you what, Gracie. I'll see you in my dreams.
Oh, George, that's sweet. Well, I really gotta go, so I guess you better say it. Oh, come on, George. You've got to say it.
Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
Yahoo Answers. Where does the phrase "say goodnight, Gracie" come from? Best answer, George Burns and his wife, Gracie. They used to do a comedy show together, and at the end of it, George would always say goodnight, Gracie. They call me Trixie. Middle. 1 decade ago. A number of years ago, George Burns and Gracie Allen had their own variety show on television. That's the phrase George always used to close the show, and Gracie would reply, "Good night, Gracie." It was a pretty good show for the 1950s. I used to watch the show all the time as a kid. Middle. 1 decade ago. It comes from an old radio show, then TV show, George Burns and Gracie Allen. At the end of the show, George would tell his partner Gracie to say goodnight, meaning to say good night to the audience. What he actually said was, "Say goodnight, Gracie." What he meant was, "Say goodnight, Gracie." But Gracie, ever the inveterate straight man, or straight woman in this case, took George at his word and said, "Good night, Gracie." Flatulent _frog. Middle. 1 decade ago, Burns and Allen, classic scenes number 9, Say Goodnight, Gracie, 8 years in 8 minutes. Published on May 31, 2014. Here is a collection of many, many brief snippets from the closings of the Burns and Allen TV show. This is where George supposedly said "Say goodnight, Gracie," and Gracie would answer "Good night, Gracie." Well, that never happened, and George is on record multiple times saying it never happened. Kyle Grimes 1 year ago. I know George said, "Say goodnight, Gracie." She would say, "Good night, Gracie." I know it like I know my name. I loved watching them as a kid. Another Mandela effect.
You say good night, everyone.
Good night.
How about saying good night?
Oh, good night.
Good night.
Yes.
Say good night.
Good night.
That's it. That's it. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Thank you.
Good night. How about saying good night?
Yes. Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Well, say good night.
Good night.
You're much smarter this year. Say good night.
Yeah, good night.
Good night. How about saying good night?
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night, and thanks for the carnations. They're
Thank you.
beautiful.
How about saying good night?
Yeah, good night.
Good night. How about saying good night?
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night. What'd you say, George?
How about saying good night?
Oh, good night.
Good night, Gracie. Gracie, say good night.
Yeah, good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. We're a little late, so Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you so much. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
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 Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Sandy, say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night. And now let's go to a movie.
Sure, let's see a picture tonight.
Yeah, there's a wonderful movie down at Warner Brothers. It's all about a woman who murders her husband.
Hold it.
Good night.
Murders her husband. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night. Good night. Say good night. Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Waiter's notice.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Gracie. Say good night.
Good night.
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 Now, Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Now say good night. What's the matter?
You said if you tell somebody to do something, they don't. If you tell them don't, they do.
Well, don't say good night.
Good night.
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 Say good night.
Gracie, wasn't it nice of Bob Cummings to come over and visit us?
Oh, wasn't it?
His new television show starts Sunday night. We must watch it.
Oh, of course.
Isn't he a handsome man?
Oh, what's he got that you haven't got?
Well,
Or couldn't get?
he's...
Or wouldn't want?
Well,
Or never had?
Gracie, say good night.
Good night. Or wouldn't know what to do with if you had it?
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night. Say good night and help me in.
Good night.
Say good night. Say good night.
Good night.
What about saying good night?
Oh, I should say not. I was so mad at her that I walked right out and left the store.
Gracie, I mean the people that are watching us.
Oh, well, I'm not mad at them. Good night, everybody.
Say good night.
Good night.
How did he get the camera inside the cantaloupe?
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Say good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Gracie, how many fellas did you kiss before me?
Good night, everybody.
Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. 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 Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Oh, I had a wonderful time. You know, a man and his wife and his two children came in, and she wanted to buy
Gracie.
it.
Gracie.
Good night.
Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Say good night. Say good night. Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Gracie, say good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Gracie, say good night. Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night. Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Gracie, say good night. Good night. Say good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Say good night. Good night. Say good night.
Good night and the coffee was
Guess
delicious.
what? Good night. Say good night. Good night. Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night.
Say good night.
Good night.
Good night. You know, Gracie, I'm sort of a poet myself. Listen to this. Roses are red, violets are blue, and if you'll say good night, I'll say so too.
That's good. Good night.
That's good night. Say 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 good night. Gracie, say good night. Gracie, say good night. Gracie, say good night. Say good night. Say good night. Gracie, say good night.
Good night and hello, Colonel Jack.
Hello, Colonel Jack.
Well, he's just starting to tune in.
Oh, hello, Colonel. Good night. Good night. Say good night. Gracie, say good night. Say good night. Gracie, say good night. Say good night. Gracie, listen to the comment. Say good night. Gracie, say good night. Gracie, say good night.
Hello, operator. Operator.
Hello. May I help you?
Gracie. Gracie, is that you? It's me, George.
George. Oh, George, is it really you? Oh, I'm on the switchboard tonight. And George, the man upstairs is very upset with you. Yes, well, he doesn't like you doing any more of those films about him. No, he says you're too old for the part, George. Oh, I gotta go. I have Jack Benny on hold. He wants to make another collect call. When am I gonna see you?
Well, not for a while, kid. I tell you what, Gracie. I'll see you in my dreams.
Oh, George, that's sweet. Well, I really gotta go, so I guess you better say it. Oh, come on, George. You've gotta say it.
Say good night, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.